Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today, I'm going to do my second episode of Versus. Miles Morales and Gwen Stacy versus Mace Windu. And if it's not welcome back, you know what to do. Subscribe so next time it will be welcome back. And now, let's just jump right into things. This battle takes place on our 498278733296. We open on off 1161. We see Miles and Gwen sitting on top of a building, eating, talking and laughing. This takes place a few years after the events of Spider-Verse, and Miles and Gwen had gotten to know each other a lot better and had recently started dating. Gwen would stop laughing after a while and would give Miles a look and would say, "Okay, seriously, we need to stop our eating habits." Miles would roll his eyes and would say, "We've said this so many times in the past and we don't go more than a week." Gwen would laugh slightly and she'd say, "You're right, but this is really unhealthy for us. Big belly burger on your off on Wednesday, the crust on my off on Friday, then we're around each other's on Sunday, and we normally get a takeaway then." Chuckling, he would put his arm around Gwen, saying, "Oh, relax, have the lifestyle we live, we won't gain too much weight anytime soon." Smiling at Miles's touch, she would say, "Seriously, we're gonna end up like Peter if we don't stop." Miles would pull back, looking at her saying, "Peter's not fat." Gwen would give Miles a look and would say, "Miles, he's got a beer belly." "Yeah, you've got a point." "Yeah, surprised we don't weigh 10 ton, Gwen would say. "I do," Miles would say, taking a sip of his drink. "I just hide it well." Which would make Gwen send out a web line, stealing one of his chips. After finishing their food, Gwen would say, "You wanna come back and chill at my place? My dad's out tonight." Miles would smile and would say, "Yeah, sure, why not?" Just before Gwen would activate her goober, Miles and Gwen's spider senses would suddenly go off, looking off into the distance where they would hear faint alarms. "Duty calls," Miles would say reluctantly. Gwen would laugh at him and would say, "Come on, Spider Boy, you should want to protect the city." Jumping off the building, she'd say, "Race you there." Miles would grin after her and would say, "Oh, you're on, Gwanda," webbing his mask to him. Arriving at the bank, they would see that there were 4 men standing there. One of them would speak, very robotic. "Come on, let's get out of here before Spider-Man or his sidekick gets here." He would suddenly be hit by a web pellet, as Gwen would say, "I'm pretty sure the term is partners." A second robber would raise a gun towards Gwen, showing little emotion in his face, when he'd suddenly be hit from behind by Miles, who would then pick him up and would use him as a battering ram to hit him into another one of his partners, who would just stay down, unconscious. Miles would look very confused at this. Criminals didn't go down that easy, even the weak ones. Gwen would leap down next to Miles and would say, "That was easy." Miles would nod, very confused. "You're right, too easy." That's when suddenly both of their spider senses would go off, as they'd suddenly be thrown back and smashed into a car behind them. Mysterio would exit the bank, holding a bag full of money, as the men Miles and Gwen had just been fighting simply disappeared into thin air. Miles and Gwen would look up in alarm at Mysterio, as Gwen would say, "Oh shit." Miles remembered how he went to Gwen's off to help her battle her Mysterio. He was beginning to think his off didn't have a Mysterio, but he was wrong. Mysterio would fire projectiles at the 2 spider teens, who would quickly jump up and dodge it. Miles would yell to Gwen, "You ready?" She'd yell, "Sure." Fist bumping each other as they'd run opposite directions, Gwen shooting web pellets at Mysterio, grabbing his attention. Once Miles was in Mysterio's blind spot, he turned invisible. Mysterio would quickly glance over his shoulder, trying to check for where Miles was, but saw nothing, but was distracted by Gwen. Just as Miles was slightly behind Mysterio, Gwen would send out a web line attaching to Mysterio's foot, pulling it towards her, throwing him off balance. As Miles, taking this opportunity, would uppercut Mysterio into the air. Gwen, throwing herself forward, would land punch after punch on Mysterio. Then kicking him backwards, Miles would web him, before swinging him round and smashing him into the floor. Webbing his hands to the ground, Mysterio would say, "No! I am Mysterio! Master of the illusions! You can't beat me!" Gwen would take his helmet off and would say, "You sure about that? I thought you were the master of the aquarium with this fishbowl on your head." Making Miles laugh, Mysterio in anger would shoot the floor, ripping the web that was holding his hand. He would raise it towards Gwen, who wouldn't have time to react, as she would be thrown backwards. "You bastard," Miles would say. Webbing his helmet to him, he would smash it over Mysterio's head, knocking him out. Miles would say, "Well, you know what they say, karma's a bitch." He and Gwen would laugh, as they would jump up and begin to swing away, leaving an unconscious Mysterio for the cops. After landing a safe bit away, they would stand up and say, "So, now that that's done, you want to head back to mine now?" Miles would smirk and would say, "Yeah, it's been a bit since we got some alone time." Gwen, smiling slightly, would pull out her goober. "Oh," Miles would say. "Yeah, oh." Gwen's goober would lie completely broken in her hand. She'd say, "Great, now I'm stuck here." Miles would take it and would say, "I would say I could fix it, but probably shouldn't chance it. I'll message Penny, she can make you another one." Gwen would laugh and say, "Alright Ratchet, calm it down." Miles would smile back at him and say, "So, if you can't get back to your Earth, you want to come back to my dorm?" Gwen would open her mouth to reply. That's when the goober that Miles was holding would begin to beep. Gwen would look at him and say, "That's strange, it was broken." That's when suddenly a portal began to open around them. Gwen would say, "Okay, not good." She and Miles would try jump out, but it would be too late. The portal would swallow them up and would launch them across the multiverse. After what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, the portal would spit them out. Gwen was able to catch herself from falling, but Miles was unable to, and the web that connected them would end up pulling Gwen down with him. Looking at each other, Miles would say, "Gwen? Miles? You're heavier than you look." Gwen would blush and would get up, pulling Miles to his feet. He'd say, "Okay, where the fuck are we?" "'Cause I'd know that," Gwen would say. Looking at the sad state of her goober, she'd say, "Okay, well we're definitely stuck here. So what the hell do we do now?" Gwen would ask. Miles would take her goober from her and say, "Well, we've got a tracer on us, so wait here long enough. Miguel or someone should find us. I don't know. That should take quite a while." "Hey, you don't bet this Earth has its own Spider-Man?" Miles would say, throwing Gwen's goober back. She'd say, "Well, considering the fact there's infinite Earths with a Spider-Man and infinite Earths without him, I'd give it a coin flip. Should we go have a look?" To which Miles would nod. Pulling on their masks, they would climb out of the warehouse and would be met with the sight of the upper level of Coruscant. The two would walk around together, looking at this new place. They expect to get some weird looks from what they were wearing, but the people that were around them seemed to be wearing even weirder stuff. Gwen would look up, seeing speeders flying overhead. She ever wondered if her Earth would ever get something even close. Gwen and Miles would stay close to each other. Gwen, who wasn't looking where she was going, would accidentally bump into a Trandoshan. Gwen would look up to apologize, to be met with the face of Bosk. He would bend down to look at Gwen, hissing in her face, "Watch where you're going, miss. It's been a while since I've collected a bounty. Don't make yourself a personal one for me." Gwen would not be intimidated, but would quickly back away, not wanting to cause trouble. Miles, who had been ready to attack, would say, "You right?" Gwen would nod and would say, "Yeah. Come on, let's get out of here." They would move to swing away. This is when a man would clumsily approach them. Miles could tell from his time as Spider-Man that this guy was off his head on drugs. Slurring slightly, he would pull out a small bag of his pocket. He'd say, "You want to buy some death sticks?" Miles and Gwen would look at each other uncomfortably as Gwen would say, "No thanks," and would jump on the wall and begin to crawl away. Miles would move to follow her, but the man would grab his arm and would hiss at him very aggressively. "I said, you want them. You do." Reaching into his pocket, he would emerge a small blaster. Miles' spider sense would immediately go off, but before he could react, the man would suddenly be hit from behind by another blaster bolt. The man would fall to the ground, and Miles would look up to see a Mandalorian standing with her blaster pointed at him. She would look down, then look back up at Miles, would say, "Watch your back in the future, kid," and would continue to walk on. Gwen would jump down and say, "Okay, this place is weird, but she is cool." As they would begin to swing away, Miles would say, "Really, she's cool?" Gwen would look back and say, "What?" Miles would pretend to be angry as he said, "I was nearly stabbed and you say the person who saved me was cool." "I'm sorry, Miles, you must have mistaken me for someone who actually gives a shit." Miles would shoot her a look, before laughing after a while and saying, "You know I love you, right?" Gwen would smile and say, "I know." Blushing slightly and turning away from him, she'd say, "I love you too." Suddenly, both of their spider senses would alert them to something happening down the street. Looking down the building, they would see a man getting harassed by two armoured men, looking similar to the person who had saved Miles a moment ago, but at the same time looking very different. Gwen and Miles would silently crawl down the building, listening to the conversation that was going on below. The man would say, "Please, don't hurt it, it's just a child." One of the armoured men would emotionlessly reply, "Hand it over. Only one person has to die tonight, don't make it two." The man would back into a corner as he'd say, "It's harmless, honestly. It might not even be one of them." The men would raise their blasters and would say, "Alright, you've made your choice, traitor." Miles and Gwen would immediately act, jumping off the building and tackling one of the men. His friend would look at him and would say, "What the?" but would be hit by a venom blast by Miles, attaching a web to one of the clones and pulling it over a lamppost before jumping up and knocking it unconscious. Gwen would jump down. Seeing Miles having equal success, Miles would walk over to the man. Getting down, he would say, Hey, it's alright, we're nice." Cringing under his mask as he said it, he could hear Gwen holding a laugh behind him. He had never been good with the quips as Peter. Miles would ask, "Why were they trying to kill you?" The man would not know what to say, but he'd look up at them and say, Are you Jedi?" Gwen and Miles would share a confused look as Gwen would say, I'm sorry, are we what?" Would say, "Listen, we don't know what's going on here, but you still haven't answered our question. Why were they trying to kill you?" The man would open his mouth to say something. That was when from his bag that was lying a bit away from him would move. Miles and Gwen would share a look. That sounded like a baby. But the man would quickly jump up. Moving past Miles to pick the bag up, he would say, "Listen, it's okay, you don't need to know." Gwen would pull off her mask and would say, "Listen, we just saved your life. We won't hurt you, we won't judge." Putting the bag down, reaching inside it, would pull out a small, green, pointy-eared creature. Gwen and Miles would stare at the baby for a second, before Miles would step forward, thinking of something to say. He said, "This is what they were trying to kill?" The man would say, "Yeah, they wanted it dead." Gwen would step forward, trying to understand the situation as she said, "It looks harmless. Heck, less than that, it looks defenseless. Why were they trying to kill it?" The man would look so confused at Gwen, shaking his head. He said, "You really don't know." Just then, Miles and Gwen's spider sense alerted them to someone walking down the alleyway towards them. Would see a man, draped in a black cloak, with the hood up, covering its face. The figure would look at the man, then at Miles and Gwen, as he'd say, "I told you to stay under cover. I wouldn't describe it as this." Miles would take a few steps towards the man and would say, "Who the hell are you?" The man would look at him and would say, "You don't want to know." Looking past him, past Gwen, he would look at the man and would say, "Give me the child." Gwen and Miles would share a quick look, as the figure would continue, "It will only be safe with me. If you don't, it will be hunted down and killed, just as you lot. You have to trust me. I will devote my life to protect it. Seeing the hesitation in the man's face, the figure would say, I'm sorry. Raising a robotic hand, the child would be yanked from the man's grasp and would soar through the air towards the figure. Miles would quickly act, diving through the air and catching the child. Gwen would give the man the child back and would say, Go! Gwen would say. The man would quickly run off with the child, as the cloaked figure would snarl in anger. I don't want to hurt kids. Let me through. He would try move past them, as Gwen would step forward, placing a rough hand on his shoulder. The man suddenly would grab Gwen's arm and would throw her over his shoulder. Miles would yell for Gwen, sending out a web line that would attach to the building behind the figure. Thrusting himself forward, he would kick the man into the wall, before trying to land a second punch, but the man would move fast. Grabbing the back of Miles's head, he would smash it into the wall, before spinning Miles round and throwing him away from him, turning around to face Gwen, who would send out web pellets. The figure would do flips as he dodged the web pellets. Losing his cloak, he would throw it towards Gwen, distracting her. He would try throw punches, but Gwen would easily dodge them. Catching his robotic hand, the man would try kick the legs from under Gwen, but her spider sense would alert her. Jumping, she would kick him backwards, where Miles would leap through. Attaching a web to his chest, he would jump and throw him through a wall. The two would move into the darkened area, but before Gwen could react, she was lifted up with force and smashed out the window. Miles would spin round, as an amethyst blade would ignite in the dark. Mace Windu would charge Miles Morales, swinging furiously. Miles would be shocked to see that Mace was moving far too fast for him to anticipate. Nearly hitting him on the chest, Miles knew he had to go on the advantage, punching Mace over and over. Mace would get a lucky hit on his leg, making Miles roar in pain, charging up a venom blast as he would punch him out the window. Gwen, who had just recovered, would look up to see Mace falling in the air. She would try send out a web to catch him, not wanting him to die, but Mace would grab it, yanking her off the wall, as they would have a fight in freefall. Gwen and Mace would get a good few hits on each other as they would hit the ground. Well, Mace would hit it like a rock, but Gwen was easily able to catch herself. Miles would land behind them as they looked at each other, as they both charged in unison, hitting Mace over and over again, not giving him any time to react. Mace would try summon his lightsaber to him. Seeing this, Gwen would send out a web line. Pulling it towards her, she would get it and smash it off the wall. Mace would look up, his eyes glowing a fierce yellow. Miles and Gwen would smile to each other as Miles turned invisible, trying to replay the tactics they had earlier. Gwen tried to distract Mace while Miles ran around him, but Mace raised his hand, lifting Gwen into the air as her arms began to bend backwards, twisting beyond where they could reach. Miles, seeing this, would drop the tactic and would run in to stop Mace, but Mace would turn around, raising his hand, as Miles would fall to the ground, screaming in pain as Mace used Shatter Point to make him feel the most extreme pain possible. Desperately, Miles would try send out a web to Mace, but the web would stop in midair as it would twist back, wrapping itself around Miles's neck, beginning to choke the life out of him. The pain of her arm being twisted backwards began to numb as Gwen stared in fear at Miles's dying form. She had to do something drastic to save him, and she knew just the thing. She sent out a web to her other arm. This was going to hurt bad. Closing her eyes, she would yank the web as hard as she could, as there was a deafening crack as Gwen broke her own arm. She would scream in pain, but this is what she needed to do. Her limp arm would just be able to move just enough as she sent out a web from her arm that would attach to both Mace and next to Miles. Miles's barely conscious form would know what to do. Grabbing it, electrifying it, roaring in pain as he was electrocuted by Miles. This would make him drop them. Gwen would quickly run forward and with her free arm would hit Mace over and over again as Miles began to charge. Miles had used this amount of Venom Blast once before and also take down Rhino. Gwen hoped it didn't have the same results on Miles that it had before. As Gwen would struggle to hold back a rage-infused Mace, Mace would pick her up with his robotic arm and would smash her into the ground, and began to choke the life out of her. Mace would hold her down with his flesh hand and would raise his robotic hand, ready to finish the job. Miles's eyes crackling cyan with electricity as his arms were beginning to be enveloped in the same kind of energy, burning his suit. Letting out a roar, he would charge and would smash his fist into the side of Mace's head. Mace would fly back and hit into the wall, sliding down it, unconscious, and would cough as she looked up at her boyfriend, who would be getting his own breath as he said, "I'd hate to live here," giving a goofy smile before collapsing. Gwen would crawl over to Miles's unconscious form. Leaning on top of him, she felt herself beginning to slip into unconsciousness as well. She tried to resist it, but she couldn't. As her vision began to go blurry, she saw a small portal begin to open in front of her. As she passed out, Spider-Ham would look around this new Earth, before spotting Miles and Gwen's form sitting on the floor. Quickly running up to them, he would check for a pulse. He found one. He reached into his comms and would say, "It's okay, lads, I've found them. And they don't look good at all. Bring them back to my Earth." Opening a portal in front of him, he would awkwardly drag Miles and Gwen into it. Moments later, Mace Windu would awaken, quickly jumping to his feet, looking round for Miles and Gwen, but they were nowhere to be seen. Who the hell were they? He had never faced an opponent anything like them, but he didn't have time to dwell on an old enemy. Summoning his lightsaber to him, he would have to repair it later. He moved into a place that he wouldn't be found by the Republic. He knelt down and began to meditate. He couldn't bring down the Empire on his own, but he wasn't planning to. He was going to find Yoda and Obi-Wan. Together, they could bring down Skywalker and the Emperor. Together, they could bring back the Order. Just as Mace's mind began to calm, he would hear a soft voice call out to him, "Mace, it is I, Qui-Gon Jinn." Mace would open his eyes in surprise, but thought it was just his head, which was still ringing from Miles's punch. He'd close it again, as Qui-Gon's form would appear in front of him. Qui-Gon would raise a hand and would say, "There is no need to fear, my friend. I am here to help. Those two people you just fought might be the key to defeating the Emperor and saving Anakin." Mace would stare confused at Qui-Gon, before raising an eyebrow and saying, "I'm listening." There you have it, guys. That was my second episode of Versus. Anyway, if you enjoyed the video, make sure you hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Next time on Versus. Two of the best assassins in movie history. Hunter of Man, the T-800, versus Hunter of the Universe, the Predator.